Welcome to McGill Minute. My name is Mary Frances Kiffmeyer, and I serve as the marketing manager at McGill. We're glad you're listening in today to discuss America's Water Infrastructure Act. I'm joined today by Mike Dowd, who is going to tell you what you need to know about this act and, more importantly, tips for you to be in compliance. Mike Dowd has been with McGill for over 24 years and leads the water wastewater practice. Welcome, Mike. Let's jump right in. What is America's Water Infrastructure Act, and why should water systems be aware of this act?
Yeah, thanks, Mary Frances. Good question. Happy to be here this morning. So the AWIA, as it's called, is the America's Water Infrastructure Act of 2018. It's a federal regulation that applies to all community water systems that serve more than 3,300 customers. And it went into effect in October of 2018. The act requires systems to complete risk and resiliency assessments and update or prepare emergency response plans. Systems must comply according to a sliding schedule based on system size. And then in this case, for this regulation, these plans have to be updated every 5 years. This is a similar requirement to the vulnerability assessments that were required by the Bioterrorism Act of 2002, but this time with an expanded all hazard approach that includes natural disasters and cybersecurity in addition to malevolent acts. Systems should be aware of this first and foremost because it's a federal regulation and there are potentially severe consequences for noncompliance. But more importantly, it's a good system management practice to understand your water system and where it's vulnerable, what things can be done to reduce risk and vulnerability, and finally, to have a plan in place for the most likely attacks or natural disasters that can impact your system.
Can you explain what steps are required to be in compliance?
Absolutely. Yeah. So the good news with AWIA is that basic compliance can be achieved relatively quickly and easily for most systems. The EPA has provided a checklist for small to medium-sized systems that is intuitive and not as complicated as the procedures recommended for the larger systems. Basic compliance is met simply by identifying the potential threats to each system asset, with assets being items like treatment plants, storage tanks, pump stations, etc. And that's it. That's once you've identified the potential threats to each asset, that's you've achieved basic compliance and can certify your risk and resiliency assessment. Taking the next steps of identifying any countermeasures or ways to prevent or mitigate threats for all these or any of these risks is optional. So yeah, basically for smaller systems, steps to be in compliance, it's relatively straightforward.
What about consequences of noncompliance? What are those?
Sure. Well, according to the rule, noncompliance comes with the potential of a fine of up to $25,000 per day. So the way it's worded would certainly indicate the EPA has the flexibility to set these fines appropriately based on system size. So it'd be hard to imagine most systems or any systems for that matter being fined that kind of amount. But I think it's enough to get systems attention to realize that this is a matter that the feds take seriously, and that's a primary reason to be in compliance.
You mentioned the risk and resiliency assessment in the emergency response plan. What specific action items might follow once these two assessments are completed?
Great question. So what this process is intended is to identify systems where they're vulnerable so they can decide what measures to take to increase their resiliency and or redundancy. So this could take numerous forms, anything from repairing a broken fence around a storage tank to constructing a second raw water intake. Adding security cameras to remote facilities would be another improvement that could come into this, or working with your IT department to secure your financial records and billing software. So it's a really wide spectrum of capital improvements, or even things as training programs for your staff to make sure that they're all aware of what measures to take in the event of an emergency. So it's a pretty broad spectrum of impacts.
Can you tell us about a community you are currently working with and what specific action is McGill taking to assist with compliance?
Yes, I can. So right now we are getting underway with the town of Leland, which is in Brunswick County. We're really just getting started with that one. The project got put on hold for a little bit, but so we're right now just in the initial stages of identifying their assets and doing some assessments. But we've got several other systems that we should be getting underway with in the next several weeks. Right now, our primary focus is getting the systems in compliance, but we're also having discussions with each system about what they want to get out of the process. And as we'll talk about in a little bit, there's quite a range of effort that can go into this process.
Should a community attempt compliance on their own?
Well, that depends on a lot of things. First and foremost, the size and the complexity of the system and the resources that the system has to assign to the task. I do know that the North Carolina Rural Water Association has been doing training sessions with small systems, and several that I know of have opted to go that route of doing it themselves. As we talked about previously, the EPA has made basic compliance with the rule a pretty straightforward and easy to follow process for smaller systems.
What's the benefit of hiring a consultant to assist?
Speaking from our perspective, I would say that the one benefit is our staff is well versed in the rule, and we can tailor an effort based on the needs and resources for each specific system. Not to say that there aren't system owners who are not capable of taking this on, but a lot of times it's just a matter of these folks being stretched too thin.
Some might be concerned about how to pay for this. How much does this cost? And is there funding available to assist?
Another great question. That's the first one we always get. The answer to the first part is it depends, which is a wishy-washy answer, but that's unfortunately the way it is. The first driver of the cost will be, does the system want to do the minimum effort for compliance, or do they want to dive deep into issues like countermeasures, source water protection, and developing a list of capital improvements projects that will increase their resiliency and reduce risk? The other major factor that will impact costs is the size of the system, more specifically, the number of assets. This can range from a system that buys all of its water from an adjacent town and has no assets of its own, or a system with a treatment plant, storage tank, pump stations, and all the way up to systems with multiple facilities and tanks and pump stations and treatment plants. The level of effort and the cost will depend on those factors. So that can range from anything from a system doing it on their own with their own forces, all the way up to, I've heard of some systems in the larger category spending six figures on this effort. Fortunately, in North Carolina, there's no funding that I'm aware of for these for this requirement. EPA gave the states the flexibility to use state revolving funds to pay for these efforts, but left it up to each state to determine if they wanted to use those funds for this. And North Carolina prefers to use their revolving funds for capital projects. So alas, in North Carolina, our systems are having to pay for these efforts themselves.
With some deadlines passed and some quickly approaching, what immediate steps should a system take?
Well, at this point, the deadlines that we've got left are for the small systems, as we're already past the first deadlines for the medium and large systems. So for these systems, the ones that are between 3,300 and 50,000 customers, the steps you should be taking are first, decide if this is something you want to try and do on your own, and if you have the resources to do that. If not, and if you identify the need for assistance, then you need to start the process of finding and hiring a consultant to assist you. Then along with that, I would say systems should decide what they want to get out of the process. Do they want just basic compliance? Is that enough for them? Or do they want to make this a more involved and detailed analysis that could identify ways to improve their system resilience and security? We can certainly help with those discussions. And we have had those discussions with several folks. So that would be what I would recommend. And then for the small systems whose first deadline is in June, I would suggest not putting this off too long. I know June seems like an eternity away, but it'll be here before we know it. And if not having any funds budgeted this year is a hurdle. What we've talked to a lot of systems about is let's go the route of basic compliance right now. It's inexpensive and can be done relatively quickly. And if we have a need to dive any deeper, we can set aside some funds in next year's budget to do just that.
That's great. Thanks, Mike, for your time today and sharing that information. I want to remind those listening that McGill can walk you through all aspects of AWEA compliance and is here as a resource to answer your questions. Be sure to learn more about the work of our water wastewater team on our website at McGillAssociates.com or email us at info@McGillAssociates.com. We appreciate you listening in today and look forward to bringing you additional topics in the near future. Thanks, Mike.
Thanks.